So now, after 1400, we come into what's called the modern period, and the theology goes from theism to agnosticism. And agnosticism is what?
Doubt.
Yeah, doubt. We can't say for sure. So here you came from a place where the philosophers were studying the nature of things because they were looking for truth about reality and studying the nature of things and understanding that they could make statements about it. But now they come to agnosticism, say, no, we can't know. The person who was the most influential person in modern philosophy was Immanuel Kant. And Kant came up with they call it the Kantian gulf. And he said that there is a reality, we just can't know it. Does that sound okay?
How did he know?
How did he know that you have to know something about that reality to know that you don't know? So his view of that reality is wrong. And they call that the Kantian gulf. And he said, you can't know reality as it is. You can only know it as it appears to you. So in other words, what happens now? Now you shift from that thing as it is to what my interpretation of that thing is. So now I can't know truth as it is. I can only know my truth about that thing. So you see the slide. You see why these things are important. And how we didn't get to where we are now, but we're going to get to it. Yeah. So contemporary philosophy, the major theology is atheism. Again, it doesn't mean that everybody is an atheist. It just means that that's the prevailing idea. You go from not knowing, you can't prove, you can't show that there's a God, to now atheism becomes the dominant philosophy, which is basically what they call the new atheists, that basically were not very good at philosophy and not very good at arguing, but basically they came out banging their pots and noisemakers and getting everybody to get on board. And it's more of a reaction against the idea that you can know truth to where you can't know truth. And the major philosophy is methodology. The other one was epistemology. I didn't cover that very much. Epistemology is the study of how we know. Methodology is, what method do you use to do this? And that becomes a war of words. Basically, even in epistemology, which a lot of Christians buy into, they think that that's the important one. But if I were going to build a building of the idea of how you do philosophy, metaphysics would be the foundation. And then epistemology would be on top of that. So without a foundation, epistemology is not a foundational concept or discipline. It's basically something that rests on top of another discipline, which is called metaphysics. I'm not trying to turn you all into philosophers today. I just want to show you how important these things are. So we're living in this contemporary period that starts around 1900 and goes through the present. So you could see that it's hundreds of years that these thoughts are built, embellished, looked at, and gone on with. But here we are, we're living in a place where, I said it Sunday morning here at church, that Bible-believing Christians who have let me say it this way, people who are actually following Jesus, disciples of Christ, we're a minority. We have to recognize we are a minority. The last Pew poll or survey that they did showed that 6% of Americans. That's across all denominations, all people. Only 6% are actually followers of Jesus. You might have 40 people who will identify as Christians, but aren't living a biblical lifestyle, aren't committed to living that Christian lifestyle. So you see that we are we're a minority in a place that is being dragged in all these other places. And from what I read earlier, you could see what's happened, that it's been coming for a long time. And it's just really picked up speed now. Anybody see the law that Gavin Newsom just signed into effect? I think it was on Thursday night that he signed this law into practice, that California, he signed a bill that said that California is not only a place where immigrants can go, but children who want to change their sex can go to California, and they will parent them. And they'll do it without having parental consent. So it just, when I was reading it, I couldn't believe it. I said, how do you get away with this? How do you get away with this? Are they going to now have like an underground railroad for children who want to go to California, that they're going to smuggle them across the country? Because minors are not supposed to get on a plane without a parent or without a note or someone bringing them to the gate to get them to go. So I'm not sure.
Probably a teacher.
Perhaps a teacher, yeah. Okay. We're going to have a time for discussion and frustration. Okay, so where are we in all of this? I want to make sure you understand that this graph going across isn't fixed in concrete. It's not like at 400 AD, ancient was out, medieval started. There's overlap, and there's overlap of 100 years in places, well over 100 years, before it becomes solidified. And that really is the point of what we want to look at this morning. If you go to the next slide, Tony, I believe it is. Those are nice circles out of this. So that, just to give you an example of if you keep on going with it, it'll show you how it works. I'll show you how it works. And so you have ancient and medieval, and so you have an overlap there, right? And the overlap is what we call a gray zone, because we're moving from one area, we're going from one area into another area, and it's basically going to take quite a bit of time for that to actually become solidified. So that gray area with those black lines, I was trying to figure out, I couldn't draw something that would actually be gray. But that's what's happening to us right now. If we keep on going down keep on going down the slide. This one shows you have one era, and in every era, every sociological era is a place of order with centralized power. And you could see, like from the last slide, you could see that the Catholic Church in the medieval period became the centralized power, but it goes through something. And in the next era, if I were looking at the two circles or the two oblongs being, say, medieval and modern philosophy, would be industrialization would become the centralized power, that industrial nations are the ones that become the power. But you notice that in the middle there's this gray zone, and that's a period of diffusion and a period of decentralization. So you could see, like with the Protestant Reformation and how it took apart the power of the Roman Catholic Church during that period. So they were overlapped. And basically, it's a very unsettled time and a time of destabilization. So if you go to the next slide, Tone, from 1900 to the present, where you know, if you look at the lines, we're starting into the contemporary period of philosophy, basically you end up with the same gray zone. And would you agree that we're living in a very unsettled time right now? Yeah. Why is it? Because in the modern period, we knew what we knew. We knew what was right, and we knew what was wrong. But when postmodernism hit, all of a sudden, you can't say. Now, is modernism completely out? No. Is postmodern completely in? No. We're in this gray zone. We're in this unsettled, unstable, we don't know which way is up, which way is down. We don't know what's right and what's wrong. In some places, if you say you know, it's okay. In other places, if you say you know, you're a bigot. Or you're microaggressing somebody if you say you know this. Because there's no set rules. Yeah? And so if you're a Christian, you're living in the place where it's very clear that if you're what I call a Jesus follower, right? That you actually have a relationship with Jesus and are obeying Jesus, you're living according to the Scripture. Not even if you read the Scripture, not even if you go to church, because there are people who read the Scripture and go to church and don't follow Jesus. Don't have a biblical worldview. Okay, and again, a worldview is the way that you make sense of reality. It's the way you look at the world around you and you make sense of it. That's a biblical worldview, or that's what a worldview is. And if you're a Christian, you look at the world through the lens of Scripture. And you have a relationship with Jesus that helps to interpret that. But if you don't have the lens of Scripture, then you're not living a biblical worldview. You know, Jesus is just your friend. You waved to each other one time and it was all good. But there isn't an obedience, there isn't a sense of sacrifice for the Lord. Okay? So we're living in this gray zone where everything is destabilized. See, it's basically what's happening, and we'll see. Who do you think the author of all this stuff is? Yeah. See, things get decentralized, and if you look at this from one perspective, the 20th century is called by a lot of sociologists the American century, where our morals and values, at least what Americans said on the surface, or an ideal that they held to, was spread throughout the world. Started out very quiet after World War II. We were established as a world power, and our influence was basically going across. I can tell you the places I've been in the world that are Christian, or among Christians, look to the United States to bring stability to their countries. And when they saw what happened, or what began to happen in the 21st century, they got nervous. They got nervous because they saw that we were being destabilized. Right? And we're nervous because we're destabilized. Mark Sayers calls that period between the two ages, the gray period, he calls that the anxious period, because what happens is anxiety is what befalls all of us. And as Christians, we got to realize that we have to have a witness in this anxious time, because everything else is kind of like shaken. It's like being in an earthquake and we're the only thing that's not shaken. And, you know, I have references in my brain from Hebrews. One more time, I'm going to shake everything. Yeah? And the only thing that's not going to shake is those of us who have, are Christ followers, are people who are not anxious. And the last book, we'll go over books. It's easier to tell you the authors and just buy whatever they wrote. But Mark Sayers, his third book is called A Non-Anxious Presence, where he puts together the two first books. They're worth reading in themselves, The Disappearing Church and The Reappearing Church, and then A Non-Anxious Presence, that our witness has to be a non-anxious witness. We have to know who we believe in. And we have to demonstrate that we believe in him, to have a non-anxious presence. But basically, this is what's happening right now in this gray zone. Yeah. The disappearing church and the reappearing church were the two other ones by Mark Sayers. I also had a question that came up here to talk about methodology. The methodology, like the way that I would say methodology works, it depends on where you are in philosophy. So what are the takeaways that we have now? That we're in a gray zone. And gray zones are unstable. And we have to understand that. See, what happens is when you don't know you're living in a gray zone, these things surprise us when we see things are unstable. Things that I once could depend on, all of a sudden I can't depend on them, right? And it makes us anxious. And anxiety is, you know how I used to describe it when you're sitting in a left turn lane and you're like the third car back and the first car doesn't know the light turned for them? You know that feeling you get? Like you want to just start pushing all the cars. It's a little bit different than that, but it's the anxiety that we don't know if this is going to turn out the way that I think it's supposed to turn out. And it becomes very, very difficult for us. Yeah.
Question? Like, would you consider like the cancel culture unstable or time out?
Yeah. I'll take questions
Okay.
at the end, okay? After we get through this. So we're in a gray zone. Gray zones are unstable, and unstable makes us anxious. When we don't know how things are going to turn out, they make us a little bit crazy. So that's where we'd put questions. Is cancel culture? Yeah, cancel culture is that whole thing is part of what we would call critical theory, or whether we put critical race theory on it. It's the woke mentality. Even all of those things are ambiguous. They're not defined. So when you get a group of people who don't want to dialogue, see, before this, if you were in the modern period, if you disagreed with somebody, you had a discussion and even a debate about it. But both sides were represented fairly to come to a conclusion. And the worst could be we agree to disagree, right? Where cancel culture is, you're not even allowed to talk. And, you know, what's the number, again, here's how I would think of it. I would say that freedom of speech is a freedom of ideas, right? And that's supposed to be afforded to us. But when you're not allowed to share your ideas, what's going on here?
No freedom.
There's no freedom. Yeah. And freedom's a very delicate subject. I get in trouble because of some of my views of what freedom means. I don't think you're free to do anything. you have other constraints to be free. And as a Christian, I think those restraints are even tighter. Because we have to obey God rather than what the law says. Right? So, you have to be able to look at those things and understand how they work. But cancel culture, the whole woke mentality, they're all signs that we're passing through one age into another. Now, here's the question. What's our responsibility?
That's, you were trying to.
That's what we'll look at in the second.
Oh, good.
And you know what? It's not difficult to understand. It's hard to do. And that's where you lose a lot of people in that area in between. No, what you're describing is, those of us who grew up in the 50s and 60s, or 40s, 50s, and 60s, we had a bit of that modern world that was still part of us, and it was because of the stability of some governments. But I'll tell you this, that what we call the hippie movement didn't start in the 60s. It started in the 30s. And you could probably even go back further and say that the seeds of it were in the 1800s. And this is the way thought works. It drips in. And then when it's kind of like a leak that finally builds up enough pressure and busts through the wall. And that's basically what we're living in now. We're living in all of those things of do your own thing, you be you. All of those mentalities are not anchored in anything. They move from a God-centered view of reality, which is the medieval period, to a man-centered reality, which is the modern period, to a self-centered reality, which is the contemporary view. So now, you can't define me, I define me. Not only do I define me as in my likes and dislikes, but in my gender. So that's how far it's gone. So it's not only gone to, man-centered. The modern period believed that you could arrive at truth through reason. The medieval period said that you could arrive at truth through reason and revelation. That was the medieval period. That the modern period said, that's all superstitious. We can just take the reason part out, claim it's ours, like we discovered it, but reason was around with Aristotle. And those philosophers, they use reason to arrive and to argue for their places, what they believed in. What happened was, once the modern period hit, basically that's where deism, the view that God made things, we don't want to get rid of God right now, we just want to say that He made the universe kind of like a clockmaker makes a clock, winds it up and lets it go. So God doesn't intervene with us, and miracles are not possible. Miracles don't happen because they violate nature. See? That would be true if God didn't exist. You would say that there is no supernatural power to make these things happen. But, so basically, deism was a step toward atheism. See, once you put God out of it, see, these are people who never read the book of Job, who gives you all the players. You have God, you have angels, and you got demons. You always have to remember that. Any trial, there's God, angels, demons, and people. So that's what we're living in now, so that Christians are mocked, scoffed at. If you say you're a Jesus follower, I believe Jesus is alive, you've just now declared that you believe in miracles. Yeah? Jesus is alive. He was dead. Yeah. and we believe he's alive, well, you're superstitious. See? And one of the signs today to me that things are just unstable, that we can label people and the labels stick. Yeah.
Can I ask, what happened to the church when it was transitioning from like that medieval period to the modern period? Like God was the center of everything, and then man became the center of everything.
Right.
I mean, people were still involved in the church.
Yeah. So during, from the medieval period to the modern period, you have the Reformation in there. So where the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, basically they were the two centers of power. The Orthodox Church, which is really a great study to if you ever have time to look at it, they broke down into 5 major centers where they had archbishops or patristic leaders, is what they call them. So that's where people went to church. But now you have the church that breaks out of the Roman Catholic Church in the Reformation, splinters into how many denominations do we have today? Because there is no centrality. So there you see just the dispersion of it. So Christians are still there, but they don't have the influence on culture. We don't have the influence on culture that we once had. That started in the Reformation, and it started over some of the stupidest things. Not the Reformation was stupid. I think that the Catholic Church definitely needed some course correction. Another long story, rabbit hole. But the effect that the church could have on mankind has dwindled over the years. To where now Christians who were missionaries, who gave their lives to bring the gospel to people that would never hear the word, are criticized as colonists.
Colonists?
Colonists.
White racists.
Yeah, that's it. And why are you white European males or descendants of white European males? We're the bad guys.
Get down with the patriarchy.
Yeah, it's a destruction of anything that has order, and it's an unstable, anxious zone we're living in, and we don't know how long we'll be in it. The one thing that we do know is that God will always have a remnant. Yeah. So Mike is saying is that the idea that in the contemporary view, atheism is the leading theology.
Right.
And if you look at, again, if you went across the United States and asked people if they believe in God, probably a majority would say yes. But what kind of God do they believe in? That would be the first thing. It's the philosophical part that really is affecting the theology, that it's easier to not believe in God. And when self is the leading thought of, we're self-centered today, who's our opponent? It's God who demands something from us. And I'm trying to think of which poll it was. Natasha Crain has a great book out called Faithfully Different, or Faithful But Different. Faithfully Different. If you haven't read that, that is a must read. She was a marketing statistician at one point, so she does research like nobody I know. But she shows polls that it's certainly among the young people that there are more atheists today than anything else. It's leading among young people that they are atheists. So
How much of the world is under the age of 40?
right, and we're raising,
Thirds.
how much of the world is under the age of 40? It's more than half. And so we're raising a generation of atheists who basically have no hope, because we're just animals with larger brains and smaller claws, is the way they describe it. Yeah. Sure. You know, and it's, again, the ages, they aren't so clear, but you can mark it by who are the dominant philosophers in those periods, and theologians. You know, you have Episcopals now who can be atheists. I dare say you can have Episcopal priests who are atheists and will come out and say that they are atheistic. Okay, we're going to take a break, just over, and we're going to set it up for 10 minutes. So we'll be herding you back.